There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no man.
Don't you even know how to be a real Indian?
Well, sometimes they have to kill us. They have to kill us. Because they can't break our spirit.
Hey everybody, it's Ian back again for another episode of Native Film Talk. And today I talked with the host of Wósdéé podcast, Majerle Lister. We had a great chat. I learned so much. He was the first guest I reached out to that was like, hey, I'll send you some articles to read that can drive our discussion. I was just like, holy shit, this doesn't give me homework to freaking talk to him. But I'm a fan of his podcast, the Wósdéé podcast. It has a very Navajo lens. He talks primarily about Navajo issues and how they affect Navajo people. But his mind is incredible. His ability to process like huge amounts of information and whittle them down into bite-sized chunks for people like me to understand. I just am enamored by this individual, and I couldn't wait to bring him on. And so I reached out randomly, and little did I know he's actually a listener to the podcast. So he had listened to a bunch of the episodes that I have out, and it was just a good conversation. We really wanted to get into the nitty gritty of like, why now? Like, in terms of representation, Rutherford Falls, reservation dogs, and now we're seeing Killers of the Flower Moon. We're like, holy shit, Trickster from Canada. We're like, we're seeing a wave. We're seeing a wave. It's great. They're turning over a new leaf. You can look at it that way, or you could look at like, why is accurate representation? Why is accurate indigenous representation, native representation now at the major motion picture level? Why do they care now? Because I'm of the belief that their intentions aren't genuine, in the sense that it's not driven by profit. Like they're driven by profit maximization. Like they're trying to make money. So where is this motivation coming from? Where's the leverage coming from? So we try to have that conversation about how much of it is influences of social justice, how much of it is influence of diversity, equity, and inclusion in an involving workplace and the involving corporate America that are leveraging, trying to push on these publicly traded companies to do the right thing in the most holistic sense. And are we really truly trying to give at-bats to those who have never had the ability to come to the plate because of the fact that we've never given them at-bats? Or is it driven by profit? Is it driven by the potential for profit? And my fear is, when it's a trend like that it will go away whenever we move on to the next thing. And I sure as hell hope we don't. So me and Majerle kind of talk about that, of like the evolution of the film industry as it pertains to native representation. Why has it always been so profitable, both when it was grossly misrepresented to now? And I think the call to action that we give at the very end is it's very simple. Just show up. When you have Rutherford Falls on Peacock TV, pay the $7 or whatever, because they don't have they don't produce analytics in the same way that regular cable television does. So a lot of it is just behind a paywall. So if you pay that $7 a month, then they're like, oh, people paid to watch Rutherford Falls. So enough people do that, then they get a season 2. And same thing with Reservation Dogs whenever that comes out. August 9th that comes out. On my birthday. I should have known that. When Reservation Dogs comes out, we get the same thing. You get enough people streaming, paying for whatever subscription service they have, or however they need to pay their ads, their sponsors, their affiliates. If indigenous people show up for that, enough indigenous people, they'll be like, yeah, there's money in this, let's keep it going. For the longest time, I think indigenous content was looked at as too niche. Accurate representation was too niche. It was like, well, there's not really a market for that. Like, are there really that many people that are going to show up for it? And plus, I don't know who you are. I don't know these actors. I don't know this director. I don't know this writer. I'd rather get people that I know are going to put butts in the seats, that are going to bring an audience. So I'm going to hire Lou Damage Phillips or whoever, you know what I mean? I'm going to hire the same native actors that you're familiar with. I'm going to keep hiring the same people over and over because that's what will draw a name. And we're seeing a shift away from that, which is phenomenal. And we couldn't be happier. But is that temporary? I think it's fair to ask that. Is it temporary? Because why now? Why in 2021 when you have you have shit being uncovered, like all of the unmarked graves in the residential schools, you have still we're fighting, the government to just uphold treaty rights, and Hollywood is all of a sudden saying, oh, now we want to turn the reins over and let them tell their story. It's like, is that really what you want? Is that really what the general audience wants to see? Like, what is the motivation? So we didn't really go that far into it, but I think I certainly have thought about a lot of things since my conversation with Marley, and I can't wait to bring him back on. I think he just has a lot of great insight, and he comes with a lot of research. He really has thought-provoking conversations, and it was a great conversation, and I hope you all enjoyed it. All right, everybody. Talk to you later. Well, today I wanted to bring on Majerle Lister to talk about really his podcast, but mostly because I'm impressed with his mind. I listened to Wósdéé podcast, and I'll say it took me a long time to say Wósdéé without yelling it, because the whole purpose of your podcast was because that's what you said your grandma would say when people, which is basically come in Navajo, and you hear a knock at the door, you hear someone knock at the beam at the front of your hogan, and you're just like, Wósdéé, and then you invite people in. And I've only ever heard people say it like in a yelling voice. It took me a while to say it like normally, but and I actually have a Wósdéé welcome mat in front of my house here in Phoenix, so it's pretty cool. I was drawn initially to the name because it was very Navajo focused. Some of the native podcasters that I see, it's kind of like all over the place. Yours was extremely Navajo, but also I'm assuming you're a poli-sci undergrad major, right?
Yeah. Undergrad, I was poli-sci at ASU.
Yeah, and so poli-sci majors are very unique in that they have a really good understanding about how a lot of things fit together at a high level, and that came across pretty quickly in his podcast episodes. And he has over 30 episodes on his podcast, and I just started binging through his episodes. My favorite episode is the one on Karen Benoni, and that's easily my favorite episode. And I just was like, let me just reach out, see if he'd be down to come on, and he was. So thanks a lot, Majerle, for coming on. And you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, I'm Majerle. I'm Topan Anesthesia, Nishlik, Lizaflane, Bushachin, Kinlichini Deshache, Hana Yafni Deshanele. I am currently at grad school at UNC. I graduated from ASU, so shout out to alumni at ASU.
Yeah, you're talking to one right here.
I know, I saw that when the Zoom came up. I was like, oh shit, like this is it, it's full circle. But yeah, no, I think you summed up my podcast pretty well, which is the intention was to be the priority was Navajo things, history, culture, participants. And I started to kind of reach out to other things that I'm interested, so if you listen to some things, you're like, oh wait, they're talking about the media. They're talking about similar indigenous struggles. But generally it's kind of revolves around Navajo, I guess, issues and topics. So yeah, no, I was really excited because someone introduced your podcast to me when I was like trying to get an idea of like the native podcast landscape about maybe a year or 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And they were like, yeah, there's this person who talks about native film. And I was like, oh, fuck yeah, that sounds awesome. But they forgot the name.
Oh shit. Of course they did.
Yeah, no. And it's so simple too. Like, and I was just like, oh, okay. Like but then I found it on Instagram and I was like, oh shit. So I binged it. And I was like really happy to hear the podcast about Predator.
Nice.
Cause I was like, oh, I've always wanted to have this discussion about like what he's supposed to symbolize, or like why he does the things he does. So I really enjoyed it. And I think I recently listened to the Ali Young one and the Natalie Benali one. So
yeah.
And I think a lot of what
covering all the Navajo ones.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna get to the Harjo one, because when they talked about the reservation dogs, I'm excited for that. But I think a lot of what they talk about, I think, fits into the discussion that we'll kind of make our way towards eventually, which is like the role of like natives in Hollywood. Mainly because I think, if I remember correctly, what you asked me was, hey, let's talk about was it indigenous representation in Hollywood. Was that the case? I don't remember if that's the exact.
No, and why, for the listeners, why I wanted to bring Marley on is because he's well read. He doesn't speak without knowing, or at least can speak without a place of somebody's knowing. Like, he's the first guest I brought on where he's like, hey, here, I'll get some readings. I'll look up some readings to send you. And I'm just like, shit, I got to do homework to talk to this guy. But it was really good because I've done enough reading to think like, oh, I read all the stuff that's out there, but nope, he sent me like 4 new articles I haven't heard of and, read. Some of it did cross over to what I've already heard. Some of it was brand new and by new authors, or rather journalists that I hadn't heard of, or people or scholarly academic journals that I hadn't heard of. So it was really interesting. One of the reasons I wanted to bring you on is because you would make that parallel between the bottom line and representation, because you would think that from a capitalism, just pure capitalist standpoint, you would think that accurate representation, at least the standalone business argument, accurate representation of minorities and like making film be a profit center, those kind of seem like they're diametrically opposed things. Like, you're like, well, how do you marry those two things together? Because I think at face value, you're like, well, there's not enough representation to capture that market to try to represent, that's why you have BET. That's why you have your own network. So you can curate that kind of content for yourself. But I think really we're challenging that notion now in things like reservation dogs. And, I say Resident Alien all the time, even though it's not native showrunner, there's native writers on there, and then Rutherford Falls coming out. And I think there's been instances in the past where there's been indigenous created content and indigenous led content, but still it's like the Hollywood Diversity Report demonstrates, like, we're not there, and at least with the higher level in terms of like budget, the highest budget productions, we're not there yet, and we're not even close. So that's kind of why I wanted to bring you on. I feel like you have some great insight and just have a good conversation about it.
Right. Yeah. And I was really happy because when you first reached out to me, it prompted the idea of, well, why do we not have indigenous representation? And then it prompted another question of, why is there an increase in indigenous representation that I think is more progressive? That it isn't based on racist stereotypes or ideas of noble savagery, or like like the tropes that we commonly come into when it comes to consuming media. And it gave me some background of where I'm coming from. Is I'm looking at things in terms of like profit, surplus value, really leaning on like a lot of economic theories that are kind of theorizing Hollywood. And so I might be like playing fast and loose with some of these concepts. So this is more of like me kind of thinking through it. But the general idea was with this question is, why has Hollywood had very limited indigenous representations that are racist stereotypes that are almost repetitive? And it's not just that. Like I said, there's other racist stereotypes. And then what prompted this new era of more progressive inclusionary indigenous representation?
If I could interrupt real quick, I think that's a great point to bring up, because you could think like, oh, they finally turned over a new leaf, or oh, they finally listened to us. But really, I'm of the same mindset as you. It's like, well, what is driving this idea for them to finally see accurate representation as a profit center? Because they're not doing it out of the graces of this isn't a nonprofit organization. Like, they're not philanthropic in their desires. Like, they are trying to make money. Like, where is this coming from? Is it genuine? Is it like, where's the leverage coming from that's getting them to finally say, oh yeah, let's give a native showrunner a chance and see if it's profitable? Is it just that it's finally been time, or is it like other forces at play that we're just not aware of or not acknowledging?
Right. That's a great summary as to like contextualizing the way I'm thinking about it. And and when you first asked that question, I immediately went through all of like, oh yeah, there's so many people who talk about the cultural and stereotypes that have continuously been the way that Hollywood and other forms of media have portrayed us. But I was like, but everybody says that, like what, like, and this isn't to say that they're wrong. I think this harkens back to what you were talking about, which is what are other factors at play? And as someone who really like focuses on like Marxist interpretations and theories of economies, I was like, oh, I know this. How would a Marxist interpret this? Or I guess maybe like an indigenous Marxist, which I, subscribe to, or at least what I call myself. And it gave me a lot to think about, because it then made me think like, well, what are the structures in Hollywood? What's the role of profit? What's the role of the corporations at play? And kind of looking at it in terms of like historical capitalism. And I really had to do research because I also had to call some friends of mine, because I'm like, I have this idea that I have like these ideas that are loosely connected, that I think are connected. I'm going to talk. I asked them about it. Like, okay, this is how I'm thinking about it. And they're like, oh no, that makes sense. And so I was able to think through some of these things with some fellow natives. One being my friend Cody.
Nice.
Who's part of Boney War Pony.
Huge fan. And I plugged him a few times on the show.
Yeah. I've been, I might have to ask him to have him come on the show
for sure
and talk about maybe the other side of this. And then I talked to my friend Andrew, who's he's a professor at U of A, and he and I talk about like the economy as best as we could through a Marxist lens. And so I was like, hey. And it's funny because he actually worked at a theater. So, and he's like really interested in film, and it's like, oh shit, this is perfect, because, like I rarely get to engage in like media theory, cultural theory in relation to like political economy.
Nice.
So like, this was like a fun thing for me. So the idea that I have, the premise is that, the things to consider about indigenous representation is the economic factors at play. And this is looking at Hollywood as the film market as dominated by like, I think right now it's 5 or 6. Let me double check really. As of 2006 or 2000 in the early 20th century, there's Disney, which is owned by Walt Disney Corporation. There's Paramount, which is owned by Viacom. There's Sony Pictures, which was originally Columbia Pictures, is now owned by Sony. And then you have 20th Century Fox, which is now, I think, owned by a news corporation. And finally, Warner Bros., which was originally called Time. It's owned by Time Warner, which the Time Warner Corporation was the creation of both Time and Warner Corporation. So these are like the big 6, I think. But when you look at the history, the economic history of the film industry, beginning at least what I understand is like the early 1920s, it was pretty much dominated by 5: Warner Bros., MGM, RKO, which I think stopped existing. I don't know if it transformed into something recently.
It probably merged into somebody else or acquired.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's the thing with these corporations, that they kind of come and go, but there tends to be like some prominent ones, and then Fox, and then Paramount, and then there's smaller studios such as Columbia, Universal, and United Artists. And so I think it's safe to say that Hollywood has been dominated by a few corporations that compete against each other for the maximization of profit. Now, this isn't something that's alone, like, and when you're like thinking through Marxist theory, it's not just economics, it's not just economic reductionism, but it's also thinking about the role of state. And so the state actually plays a large role in kind of maintaining this structure. And so some kind of brief history with these corporations and the state is that in the early like 1920s and 30s, I think I want to say the 30s, you have what's it called? I'm trying to look at my notes really quick. But you have like the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NRA, of 1933, which during its creation as a legislation, there was a battle between the smaller companies, the sound companies, and the movie companies. as to whether or not they should allow monopolistic behaviors and practices go on. It actually allowed them. Like in the end, the legislation was like, we'll let it be unchecked. And so from here, these corporations would then structure themselves in a way that I think I don't know if you know about this. It gets a little complicated because, again, like I said, I'm playing a little fast and loose with this.
Okay.
But like it's the structure is you have production, distribution, and exhibition. You have the production of the folks who make the movie, the distribution are the people who distribute it, but then you have exhibition, which are like the movie theaters.
Yeah.
So it's kind of split into it. And this time, which they refer to like 1920s and 1960s, is like this idea of like the golden age of Hollywood, where these dominant companies just raking a bunch of cash.
Yep.
And the way they do it up until like the 1940s, the early 50s, was this vertical integration, which is the corporations would not only have control of the production, they'd have control of distribution, and they'd have control of the exhibition.
Yep.
So that went
and that is pure monopoly in the sense that if you own the production company, you own really the ability to pay your actors, and then you own, it's like George Lucas, man. You got rights to even the merchandise. Like you're gonna make hand over fist money, like all throughout the process. If you own the theaters, you own the marketing, you own everything. Like there's ability to turn profit everywhere. And at some point, the government's gonna wise up and be like, hold on, somebody's making too much money. It's unfair. They make attempts to be a free market at times. They make attempts to pivot to try to be truly a free market. And this was one of them of what you're describing. In 1960, they were kind of broke that up, it sounds like.
Right. And that's I think 1948 is when the US Supreme Court ruled that like in favor of antitrust action, which is like, hey, we can't have all these monopolies. The idea was to encourage competition. So like these corporations need to like knock it off. And what had happened was one particular instance, or one very big kind of play in it, was like, hey, corporations, they can have say in the production and the distribution, but they can't control the exhibition, because when they did that, they would own theaters that then would only play their movies, and so they were like, these need to be separated. And so that lasted for a bit, and then you hit 1960s and 1970s. Let me see really quick. Yeah. So you hit 1960s and 1970s, and this is where things get a little complicated, because 1948 is when the antitrust laws break the corporations up. They try to like really get rid of monopolistic behaviors and practices. But then you have the rise of television. And at this point, movie companies between 1940 and 1950s, their sole revenue was just making money at the theater, like that's it. And so with the rise of television, they're like, how do we like use television to make ourselves revenue? And so you have like one person named I think his name is Lou Wasserman, who becomes one of the managers or corporate CEOs. I don't know exact terminology, but he starts to run Disney, or was it Disney? One of the big six. Okay. And he starts to like use like their movie titles to play on the movie, like on the TV. He starts to sell he acquires the, let's say an example, he acquires Wizard of Oz, and then he's like sells it to the television to play that movie on their thing. But yeah.
So this is the dawn of playing movies on daytime television, essentially.
Right. Like I think it's like in this, and it took me a while because I'm like, holy shit, they didn't do that all the time.
Yeah. There was a time when they didn't play movies on TV.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, whoa, I didn't know this. And
you just educated me and probably everybody listening.
Right. And so like he also started to do like independent productions based in Hollywood, where he would sell like properties for folks to produce and make their movies. And these independent production companies would then be dependent on these movie companies for distribution and release. And so, he really helped make that like possible. And then he also started making movies solely for television. So not only did he like acquire the rights of movies prior and then said, hey, you want to play this movie on your television? All right, pay me. But he also was like, hey, let's make movies specifically for television. And so this is how revenue was created for the companies after antitrust laws separated them, kind of really declined in the profit, but also you have the rise of television. So it's like a way of like companies integrating technological advances for the maintain of like maximum profitization.
Yep.
So
well, I think
go
that's
ahead.
I think that's an important connection that you make in the history of one, how we arrived to this point, but also what is driving the motivations of what's coming. Because if you don't know, your history is going to repeat itself, and I think that's what we're seeing with the onslaught really of streaming services that is starting to outweigh regular cable television, where they're starting to follow the same business models, where they're like, hey, we'll just launch a streaming service on our own channel instead of trying to have Sling or YouTube television. If we just launch our own streaming service and produce content exclusively from us. So even though you have the antitrust laws of 1948, where you're kind of like, hey, you can't control all the way through exhibition. You got to break it up somehow. Now we're kind of going back to that monopoly market with what you're talking about, even though it's more competitive in that you have a lot of different platforms, you have so many different offerings. You could make the argument that there's going to be a monopoly at play potentially, or a duopoly with you have Netflix, you have Amazon Prime, and really it's those two, and then Hulu I feel like is kind of just trying to come through and pull some smaller markets with them to try to compete with Netflix and Amazon Prime.
Right. No, you I think you summed up like, and this is where this idea of there's some, like when I was reading this, there's this, to the background behind this economic theory isn't just Marxist, but it's like this idea of like Fordism versus post-Fordism. Fordism is like this idea where, when you think about Ford Motor Company, how they would have assembly lines, and it would go through, and at the end of the line you'd have a truck. And originally that's how movie companies would operate, which is like production, distribution, exhibition. But then you have like this post-Fordism, which fits into like what people refer to as kind of, I think, I don't know the exact thing, I'm gonna say 50s or 60s, but I could be wrong about that. But afterwards there was this transition, which speaks to what you're talking about, is this kind of rise again of these monopolies, because once you hit like the 60s and 70s, you have the rise of neoliberalism, which is like one particular aspect of neoliberalism is the deregulation. And this actually went in line with the movie industry, in the sense that film companies moved back into controlling exhibition, the exhibition portion of like the studio system. But in this case, they were really focused on the global market. And so they actually kind of retain that now. And this also, what accompanies this is you have not only the return of kind of the studio system where it's production, distribution, exhibition, but I didn't mention this, but there's also this loosening of like movie rules, like the Hays Code, which is like like certain codes that movies have to follow, which is like, hey, I think one example, like Bonnie and Clyde, I think when the original one came out, it made Bonnie and Clyde look cool, like anti-heroes. If I remember correctly, I could be mixing it up. But the point being is, as a result of that, Hays Codes was like, all right, you can't make these villains look good. So that's one thing. Your movies can't do that. And so once the 60s and 70s come by, you have them.
You can't popularize crime. You can't romanticize crime to influence audiences.
Yeah, like the sexual deviancy cannot be shown. But 60s and 70s also has this moment where, due to deregulations, people not following the codes, people then were like, hey, let's make a movie like this. And I think, and so there's some examples of that. And it's funny because when you have one example, I was thinking about this, is like, oh, what's an example of Hays Codes? Like with native imagery. And I always, for some odd reason, and this might be a stretch, but I was thinking like Billy Jack, where like you have like a bunch of movies that make natives look either like bad or like noble savages. But Billy Jack, and I haven't seen that movie in a while, so maybe I'm misinterpreting what I remembered.
It's okay.
But like, you have like this new guy, I think it's 1970s, where it shows him in a progressive light, like the student movement, where now he's like, oh wait, the native guy is actually cool, and he knows karate, he's kicking ass, and so I always thought, I was like, when I was reading this history, I'm like, that might explain Billy Jack a little bit. I don't know. But anyways,
I think another example would be Little Big Man, because that came out in 72. I just looked it up, 1970. So that's around the same time where it's like, it's not necessarily revisionist history because you have Dustin Hoffman that's kind of being like, oh, like an adopted native, but it is in the sense that you have a complete flip of the narrative in that you're demonstrating native humor, but also you have a misrepresentation still of like who native people are, and they're still period Indians, they're still period pieces, they're not captured presently. So it's like it's not as accurate, I guess, as Billy Jack, where like you're modernizing who people are, where it's like, well, actually, today we probably learned jujitsu instead of karate, but in the 70s when karate was popularized and everywhere, Billy Jack is closer to, I think, accurate representation of what you're saying.
Right. Like it's Navajos would be like Tibet Jitsu, where we learn all our techniques taking down sheep.
For sure.
But I think that's right. Like you push on something where like the tropes are kind of still there, but they're progressive. Like they're not as bad as like what had happened before. And so, kind of going back to the economic history, and maybe cultural history at this time too, because the movie industry then was able to just start going back to making super profits. And then you have like 1970s with like blockbusters like Jaws and Titanic, which was like, hey, we're just going to invest all our money in this and we're going to just hope it pays back.
Well, yeah. And now we see that again with the Avengers, where it's just like whoever has the biggest production budget can yield the highest profit, really. And because you're trying to attract a global market at that point.
Right, exactly. And so like you have this 80s, 90s, it kind of comes through. And the point then that we want to kind of the thread line that is important about this conversation is that these companies, these large dominant companies, are making lots of money, that no matter what, the goal is to still maximize profit.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to learn how to they have to the logic of accumulation, of capital accumulation, is still there. Like it doesn't go away. And that they have to adjust themselves with like the 50s and the television series, and that like this is something to really consider, particularly that like and this kind of then is the connecting point between this profit motive and the ability to maintain itself throughout all these different times and different pressures, whether the pressure comes from the state to break monopolies apart, or the pressures of like the 60s and 70s, the student movements, the Black Panther Party, all of these political social movements that are kind of forcing a new that are challenging the current common sense, which is like, hey, we need to rethink it, which in line kind of fits with like what's going on with critical race theory and what you're talking about blockbusters, which is like Fast 9, like family,
Mm-hmm.
that it's blockbuster. And so anyways, I don't want to get too lost because I'll go in a long
no
tangent.
It's okay. I mean, there's so many layers to that. I mean, there's instances of that you can see where there's production companies across the United States. A lot of them are in right to work states. Like they purposely go to these locations where it's exactly what you're talking about, where it's like maximum, like profit maximization is the goal at every step of the way. And so while I talk about native representation, about what's already been done, like this conversation is more about like, where do we go from here? What's on the horizon? And it's really what you're talking about. And what I try to, I think, identify, and I fucking hate this, but I'm gonna have to like listen to this episode like 2 or 3 times over again, because like you're dropping a lot of knowledge in that. It really is, why now? Like there was a plateau reached when Smoke Signals came out. We were like, yes, here comes the tidal wave. Like it's just the tide is receding. Here comes the wave of native representation, native content, native led content, native created content, and it just disappeared. And then when I interviewed Sterling Harjo, his perception, his assessment of it was the money in the independent film market had just dried up really at that point. And so there was but at that point, it's just like, shouldn't the audiences tell you where your money is, where your money should be spent, where it's going to be spent? But for the independent film market, they were like, well, we don't have enough. They turn their pockets inside out. They're like, well, got to leave it to the big box offices to make the money now. And then income Titanic, 4 or 5 years later. And it just started that new wave of like big box office productions. So I think it's important to have this conversation, because why now? So what's your assessment on that?
Right. And so, and that's what I liked about listening to your interviews was they were pretty much picking, they were demonstrating, at least in my opinion, they were validating this argument that we will touch upon later, which is the issue that people have with Marxist economics is it's like very totalized, like, oh, people don't have any say or agency. But when I hear what you're talking about with these folks who are engaged in this industry, I hear like agency. And that's why I sent you one article by Brian Young, who I worked with briefly.
New York Times article?
Yeah, I worked with him briefly. And it was funny because our work together was actually, he just helped us exercise. It was for a study that we were doing.
Oh, nice.
And I think he recently released a book too, that's getting a lot of praise. So shout out to Brian. But that there's still native agency in this. And so to go back to your original question, which is why now? And there's kind of following the history is you got like early 21st century. The main six are, as I mentioned earlier, which are, Disney, Paramount, Sony, 21st Century Fox, Warner Bros. So these corporations are now the biggest ones. And what's interesting about this, and I'll use the example about Disney, and this isn't particularly my example, but it's what I read, and I'll include the name of the articles if folks can get it. They're kind of hidden behind a paywall of academia, which sucks, but yeah, we'll see what we can do. But this author who uses Disney as an example, actually for some, like I didn't expect this, but he talks about how Disney in 1996 actually bought Capital Cities, which is another corporation that was the parent company of ABC Television, which is why you see a lot of ABC Disney stuff. And ABC actually owned a very popular ESPN news cable that was very prominent in Asia and Latin America. And this was in 1996.
Wow.
And so prior to that, in lieu of these talks, Pocahontas, like one of the famous native, like quote unquote representations, put out, that's pretty famous, was put out in 1995. And so this author argues that Disney could put out Pocahontas to rebrand Disney's image in Latin America. And then he uses examples around that time with Beauty and the Beast, was meant to cater to French audience the same year that Disneyland Paris was opened. And then even Mulan, which I think was 1995, 1996, one of those in the mid 1990s, during this time when Disney acquires Capital City, put out Mulan to cater to the Asian audience in China because executives had just visited China. And so this is like why what we start to realize, okay, like this corporation Disney is putting out certain type of media, certain type of projects to cater to these different areas in the world, because it's not just confined to the US at this point, it's global. And so I thought that was pretty striking because it speaks to this transition of more respectable, or I guess more indigenous representation that speaks to like the global market. It speaks to how corporations are putting out certain types of movies to appeal to an audience to gain profit that also relate to their economic market relations, particularly in Disney acquiring Capital City, which is parent company of ABC, which has ESPN, which is popular in Asia and Latin America. And so that this is like, I was like, oh wow, that's really interesting.
It's all connected. I think that
right.
I think that that's something that I try to hit on is like when it comes to diversity and the bottom line, until it affects their bottom line, like they're not really going to care about diversity, whether that's sponsors or affiliates of theirs pulling their funding, saying like, because you refuse to get on board with whatever this new stance is or new position, social position, right or wrong, if it's going to affect their bottom line, they're going to decide to follow suit, and they'll decide to get in line and say, okay, now we support BLM. Now we support, whatever, the cause is or call for advocacy. Then they'll finally start to do things like that. And it's at that point, it's a domino effect, it's just like a margin call where it's like once one starts happening, eventually the other financial institutions, the other corporations, they'll follow suit. So yeah. So what's your assessment on where we are today?
It's like you're reading my mind. It's because I'm still like, I'm barely getting into the early 2000s right now. But what's interesting about what you're saying is that these corporations not only have to change their policies, change like what kind of investment or capital they put into projects and how they distribute it, and they're with the goal of maintaining or gaining profit, is that they also have to alter their structures. So like in the beginning, like the company structure of the movie industry was kind of like a U structure, where it was very like top down, hierarchical. But due to like these certain pressures, political pressures and economic pressures, they kind of had to shift to decentralized. And it's usually attributed to like what I mentioned before, which is like the Fordist time period of U.S. American capitalism to the post-Fordist. The U model, the very hierarchical vertical model, is associated with the Fordist, and the more decentralized, like spread out, geographical, multi-divisional corporate structure is associated to the post-Fordist. Now, the paper that I read was like, it's arguing, it's like, no, it's a mixture now. And it's a mixture because of the economic, political pressures of the global market, being that you kind of have to be in the middle. You can't be too hierarchical, or you have to be in the middle in a sense that you have to maintain the authority and the hierarchical presence.
You can't have a militarized leadership structure where it's hierarchical, like what you're talking about, but you also can't be at the other extreme where it's decentralized leadership, where everybody has autonomy and freedom to make decisions, because you still have regulatory, constraints. You still have that bound your, whether it's your economic footprint, your environmental footprint, or your regulation, or how you're existing in the regulatory jurisdiction, or wherever you're filming, producing. So you definitely need a mix of the two. So that I think like matrix leadership structures is usually what we see now, where you are an employee that has like, you report to one organization, but you technically like functionally support like three others. And I think that's like what's like kind of the leadership, or at least the organizational structure, that's pretty common now in corporations, especially multinational corporations, global corporations, where they're like, okay, you'll support APAC, but your leadership, you'll support Asia Pacific, but your leadership is still in the United States. And so you kind of have like, opposing forces. But yeah.
Right. No, perfect. Like, again, like I said, you're reading my mind, the direction that I was going, which is what this author argues. And it makes sense to me, which is what he says is like, what had happened now is this new corporate structure, which is a mixture of both, which is the firm line, the authority of the U structure, which is like the monopoly, and the decentralized combined, to which you have a big corporation that owns multi-divisional corporate. It has multiple companies, and the multiple companies have enough autonomy to cater to different markets around the world that are diverse and segmented. And they have enough autonomy to do that, so that like it's enough like to deal with whatever pressures, whatever things that they see in there. But there's still that firm authority, which is if Disney says, hey, knock it off, they have to listen, or they might just not rebrand, but do a shakeup, which is get rid of some people if they're not making the bottom line, or if they're not, in tow with what is the line that is top down. And so you have this, what is, I think, is a good characteristic of what's going on in Hollywood, which is you have these dominant companies, and then they're all multi-divisional, that are not only just in movie, they're also in like Sony is an example of it, not just being a movie production company, distribution, but also a music, like it's a music company. So they're like spread out, like they're all around the world, different types of sectors. And you have that, you kind of have this, you have it right now. And now we get to like 2010, which is then with like, because of the decline of the profit, and I can't remember, hell, I can't even remember what came out in 2010, to be honest. Like, like it's kind of like, what did come out there? Like I can't remember.
Avatar, I think
it was Avatar. Yeah. Like I can't even tell you the story of Avatar. And this is more of like a anecdote to say that to me proves that like there's definitely a decline in the profit of theaters by like 2010, which then allow for the rise of independent companies, which goes to what you mentioned Harjo was talking about, which is now there's room for folks to kind of get in on this and do something different. And then there's also kind of harkening back to the television example. Now you have like streaming, you have Netflix, you have
this is I hate to take this on the segue. I'm a beer drinker, and so this is so analogous to like the beer industry. I've seen so many documentaries about really the life cycle that you're talking about right now. Is the market life cycle is the same trajectory, same path. It's so interesting how they're just in. You could lay them in tandem, like the timelines. Context removed, it's following the same path where the big three were on this like too big to fail path, and then eventually they kind of like the market dries up. They're like, okay, we kind of maximized all the profit, like everyone's drinking our beer and we're landlocked. You're really like the three have taken as much market share as they can, and then a shakeup happens. The craft beer industry comes along and they're like, hold on, we're losing money there. And so whether it's creating their own knockoff brands, you look at the big three, Miller, Coors, and Budweiser, and you look at all of the companies that they own, there's a ton of craft beer companies that they own. Blue Moon's under there, Leinenkugel is under there. There's so many you can think of that you would consider craft beer companies, but really they're competition. So they were either acquired by the big three or they're heavily pushed out in like supermarkets where they're not allowed to sell in supermarkets because the big three will completely take over the aisles, and they'll pay for the aisle space. They'll pay for prime aisle space, head level instead of waist level. So they'll make sure that those smaller craft beer companies don't have the ability to compete as much as possible. And you're describing exactly that kind of same timeline.
Right. I mean, and I'm also thinking candy. I've recently got into candy. I've like enjoyed candy for a bit, and I'm like, but I did some research and I'm like, holy shit, like Hershey's owns a lot of these things, but they're all different colors, different packages, and it make you think you have like diverse markets, which I think speaks to like a lot of Marxist critiques of capitalism, which is like the critique of like, oh, capitalism is the most, it gives you diverse options, but it's like when you look at the options, they're kind of repetitive, and they're not just repetitive, but they're also like made by the same companies.
Absolutely. I mean, we're both drinking sparkling water right now. You're drinking a LaCroix. I'm drinking an AHA. AHA is, this is a Coke product. I mean, it's a prime example of exactly what we're talking about. Like, just because it's a rebrand and it looks unique and it looks different, like, I'm positive that Coke, Pepsi, they saw opportunity to say like, hey, look at that sparkling water industry. Perrier was always across the pond, and now it's like penetrated into the US market. So they're like, oh, we need to start pushing out our own products. And I think that we need to start looking at the native film industry with that same lens. And I think, frankly, what has done it is the term indigenous, because now it's no longer just a United States thing. Because I think for the longest time, the term Native American, American Indian made it so native, so United States focused. Now this term indigenous has global reach, and it's expanded our palette, but it's also expanded our idea of like who indigenous is, like reimagining this title of like First Peoples. Like that includes when you like these borders are just kind of like fictitious lines that have been established by pieces of paper. Like they don't really exist. Like you take those borders away, you look at First Nations people in North America, like that entire land, that entire peninsula, that entire piece of land is all indigenous people, and that spans to Australia, New Zealand. It spans to every single continent in the globe. And I think that's where maybe the potential for like, oh, we can gobble up some market share because indigenous people have similar experiences regardless of what continent they reside on.
No, and this is where we now start to connect this economic history of corporations, the incentive, or not the maximization of profit, but also the way that corporations use a decentralized structure to tap into like niche markets, which speaks to like this idea of, and this is like something that came to mind. I wasn't thinking about this, but when I was talking to Andrew, he was like, no, this makes sense because this helps us understand why these smaller production companies are putting out more like representation of indigenous stories, and this isn't to say that, I mean, they might not be independent as well. They actually might be part of corporations. I should have done some research about like these FX that's putting out Reservoir Dogs, reservation dogs. Is it reservation dogs?
Reservation.
Reservation dogs, to see who it's connected to. But yeah, like it allows it to then kind of tap into niche markets, which are like, hey, the idea, like what you said, is indigenous is a global word. Like it's not just the US. And so that speaks to like the global market, as well as the way that it's transnational corporations are able to do that. Multinational corporations are able to kind of,
it's so interesting how like really you talk about the Fordism versus post Fordism. I hate that this shit's all connected and I never realized it. So like in in production line processing, there's really three main types. There's line processing, batch processing, and custom. And those like three different types essentially are like line processing is traditionally like assembly line, what you're talking about. There's not a whole lot of customization. It's very much like in a straight line. You have people buying one product and you're going to crank that one product out. Whereas batch is like, well, maybe we don't need to sell 1,000 units of this at one time. There needs to be customization. So we're going to offer an array of colors. Typically you use batch processing in like shoes, where it's like, we're going to offer the same kind of shoe, but we're going to offer an array of colors. So like think of Nike shoes where you're like, oh, I see this same, Nike Monarch, but like in different colors, or Nike Air Max in different colors, Air Force Ones, whatever it is. That's more like batch processing. And then there's the custom line, whereas like that takes the most time. It takes the most labor. It takes the longest time rather. But there's also profit to be made there because you can carve out this market for yourself, and you might not have as much competition. The only issue there is if you have too much demand, you might not have the ability to ramp that production up because it is such custom production. And so I think a lot of times bigger corporations, they look at the custom production line model. You can make that analogous, that metaphor, to whatever market. Anything that requires the specialization of labor is kind of something that they usually contract out or they refuse to get into because they're like, well, when this interest is dried up, we have this specialized labor, this specialized production, this specialized equipment. We can't repurpose this. So I'm not really interested in buying all of this native stuff, buying all this indigenous stuff and hiring these indigenous people, because when the market dries up, we're going to be stuck with all these people. And is there a market for that?
Oh, yeah. I was even thinking like in terms of like division of labor, that like you always hear a lot of people like, oh yeah, there's a first native director, first native sound person, first like, or not first, but like the increase of native participation in that type of work speaks to what I think is when you talk about all this, and I really appreciate that side that you're bringing about, because I think a lot of Marxists tend to speak more about like these macro economic aspects. They don't necessarily think in terms of like neoclassical ideas, but I think what you're saying speaks to, kind of connects both of them in a sense that now it makes me think about like the division of labor, how Marxist theories of division of labor might fit within this increase of native participation in that type of work. And so, yeah, no, and I think so. I think our conversation right here has been a mixture of like the last 5 minutes has been a mixture of what like the independent aspect, like having smaller companies are able to then cater to niche audiences, create more specific types of projects. And then I think we kind of, and this is maybe what I'm thinking, then another important aspect is that we kind of go back to these CEOs, and this goes back to the report, the diversity report, and some quotes that I took from it, because I was like, there's no, I kind of did the F search, and I was like, I looked up capitalism, I looked up profit, and it's funny because profit, when I looked it up on the PDF, it was in a sentence with diversity. And so the two quotes that I pulled from it, which I think reveal the connection between profit and this increase of indigenous representation, can be summed up by these two small sentences. The first sentence being, research shows that diverse companies are generally more profitable. And then the second sentence, and this is all on the same page, the second sentence is, diversity is not socially just, it's also profitable. So like that to me right there, I was like, oh, perfect. Now we know how. Now we know the language.
You can leave right there.
We're done. And then I looked. I was like, all right. So let's look at the CEOs, the people in charge who make these decisions. You have, was it the chair of the company is like 92% white, and
Mhm.
the senior executives are like 84% white. And I think the following percentages were dependent on men. So it's like a lot of white men are in these
Yep.
positions. And what I think was really interesting about this, and because I was like, all right, I'm going to talk about this, but I also don't want to over determine or over totalize capitalist forces. And the idea is that I don't want to argue based on this idea of capitalist forces where it's abstract. What I want to argue is that capitalism is maintained by our activities, individual activities, and that are structured by institutions and larger arrangements of economic structures. And so that leaves open to understanding why the main people in charge of these companies would then, whose job is to like survey the cultural and political landscape and say, okay, this is what I see. How do I make money from this?
Mhm.
And when you have like a predominantly white men in these positions who are influenced by their position economically, but also influenced by whatever media they consumed first, which is like these old Hollywood westerns.
Yeah, because you think about, I can't remember what the median age would be, like just guesstimating, like at the point of their careers where these chairmen will be in the C-suite, like just think about. So let's just give them a good age of like 55 to 60. Let's be conservative and say 55. So 55 from today, let's go 56 so we can make it even. What would be 56 years from now? When would they have been born? Let me see. I'm gonna try
Like
to
60s and 70s, kind of, if I remember correct. Yeah. Or maybe like 70s.
Exactly. So 1965 is when they would have been born. And so this is like, what movies, what television would they be consuming? How diverse was television back then? When you look at the diversity report, you look at way back then, it was like white men in all the movies. Directors was all white men. The women's liberation movement was barely starting. The civil rights movement was barely like, Martin Luther King had been killed around that time. And so it's like, gosh, like we were still in its infancy of where all the movements that we're starting today. And so for a lot of them, they might not be on board. They're just like following suit because of the bottom line, because they're being driven in that direction. Some people might be curmudgeons and just like, I'm not going to follow these liberal, the liberal media, this and that. And it's just like, it's a hoax, that it's a big deal, just do what you got to do. And they might just fund projects to just appease people. We don't know, but you can give a safe assumption that because these executives are going to be from the 55 to 65 range, it's going to be a lot of ignorance maybe. And I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a gross assumption, but I think that the past film industry has demonstrated that. Why now? And so really that's the question, is just like, what's going to happen?
Right. And so going to like that is, you have these white men in these very powerful positions in the film industry who are influenced by whatever media they consumed since they were born, that usually, again, has racist stereotypes or, these cultural stereotypes, but they have to reconcile that with this new, like, progressive landscape. You have the Black Lives Matter, you have the Occupy movement, you have global struggles for liberation, like Palestine. You have people in people in France, riding against their government for austerity wages. You have Brexit. So they have to survey this, and they have to reconcile how they think natives should be represented. And I'm focusing on natives to kind of pivot our way to that discussion. And then they have to reconcile that with the constraints and the forces and pressures that exist globally. And I think that's where then reconcile that and think about that in terms of profit. And so they recognize, like, like a lot of, I think the cancel culture, which people attribute it to the left, I think was started by the right. They were the ones who named it. You have like wokeness kind of becoming more prominent, and their critiques of wokeness, but then you kind of have like, oh, woke companies, like, oh, look at Pepsi. They want to stop police brutality. Ben and Jerry's, and all these kind of like new progressive things. And people are like, I think generally, I think they see that and they're like, oh, it's a step in the right direction. And I don't think they're naive. I just I think then when we think about it, it's like, well, what else is influencing? And this is where the profit comes in. They're not being woke because they're like, they had a moment in diversity training where they're like, oh, I recognize my privilege. You know, I know what white rage is, you know.
That subconscious bias training really is paying off, guys. I'm seeing the light.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. Like, you know, it's not like they started like, oh, I apologize for what my people did to you, your people, you know. That didn't happen, because you still have to reconcile that with their position in a corporation that's to maximize profit.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that's how I think capitalism through like through like the oligopoly or monopoly industry in Hollywood, I think to me it describes why racist tropes were used for such a long time. That is, it was profitable because people who watched these movies were influenced by racist caricatures in their textbooks, and how, you know, the government spoke of them, how they, you know, depicted them, the representations that existed prior. So they're like, oh, no one's going to challenge this. No one's going to challenge this movie where we make Geronimo the obvious bad guy, which is, you know, like, oh, you know. And so it operated, but then you have like this new transition, or you have this new revival, or this challenge to the common sense of saying, no, that's not, like, you know, like critical race theory, the revival of Marxism and socialism and communism, and the fight for third world liberation in the 60s and 70s, that kind of transition. And then even now with like, oh, hey, like, we're not like, they challenge how we perceive things. And so to me, that this idea of like profit motive, capitalist maximization profit, with the in tandem with this previous racist stereotypes, as well as the agencies of people, explain why you have Hollywood. Not only explains why we have more people, why we have more indigenous representation now, but why we've had such like repetitive racist stereotypes for such a long time, and that the progress that we counted was like A Man Called Horse, or was it, you know, like white people playing natives in a more positive light, Billy Jack, you know, and it's very incremental and gradual.
Even Little Big Man, an example we brought up earlier.
That's the one. And so like, and it I think to me it explains why we've had to like deal with that for so long.
Yeah, I mean, it went from, you know, non-native people telling our story. I mean, they're still telling our story, but like non-native people really getting enough rope to say like, okay, we'll actually tell a closer story, because I mean, it could be because their heart's in the right place. I mean, these people are pushing up scripts all the time, but they need someone to actually fund them and produce them. And so they're pushing out. So I'm sure there's progressive scripts that have existed since the dawn of time. The only time we've really had accurate representation, we learned from the documentary Real Engines, was what Marley was talking about, like the early 1920s. That was like the most accurate representation of Native people, because we were existing, because there was this perception that we were like an endangered species, that one day we need to capture these people for posterity. And so in the 60s, 70s, when we started getting things like Little Big Man, in the 80s at Billy Jack, like these scripts were finally getting greenlit because the Westerns were played out. Like the tropes that Native people were represented in were just played out. Like, there's not enough money in this. We need to mix this thing up a little bit. Let's see what happens.
Right. Like it's, and I think that's why I don't know. Like I said, I was very surprised, because I was like, has anybody like thought about, I mean, I think people like, for the most part, accept like, oh yeah, no, this is like, I think it's a cynical take of like it, to kind of come to this conclusion, is a very cynical take that of capitalism, of like, oh no, we're just getting more representation because of profit. And that is, I think that's one factor to maintain. And this is where I think I kind of come in, and as an indigenous person, say like, no, actually, there were a lot of people advocating who are really putting a lot of work to get accurate, dignified representations of indigenous people that counter and challenge these ideas, that aren't just, I mean, the article we talk about is Brian Young, who writes a piece where, to summarize, he writes that he's no longer going to like play these
stereotypical Indians.
Yes.
Like period. Basically, he like said, I'm not going to be period piece Indians because they're never captured in the right light.
Right. And that's, to me, that's him recognizing like, okay, there's a larger economic historical force kind of pushing how natives should be based on profit, but I'm going to choose not to do that, or I'm going to choose to do something else. And I think there are people who are doing that with like the increase in technology. People are like buying cameras on their own and filming stuff. Like there's some Navajo people I know who are doing that.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. I think what you're talking about is like where we go from here, where it's like the YouTubers, the TikTokers. I mean, we've already seen it with non-native people and I shouldn't say non-native. Yeah, I'll just say non-native people, because there are people of color that are getting these opportunities where there's such a market in their recognition and their likeness and their who they are, that you see YouTube stars, you say social media influencers get cast in movies and commercials and stuff. And I think that's a lot like, to use the beer story that because it's just something I'm familiar with. It's like they see the craft brewery starting to take over and they're like, hold on, what if we just write a fat check and take them out of the market and get them on our side so we can absorb that market share? And I think we're starting to see that, and we will see that. There's a ton of native influencers online and on YouTube, and one of which is like Boney Warporny that and I'm a huge fan of his work. Like that's an example of somebody who creates content that it's so nuanced to like almost reservation just only natives. And not to say that you have to be res to see it, but it hits different when you're res and you're like lived on the res or you're familiar with the res. And you see that and you're like, man, someone could take off like that and they could get, absorbed by a larger company because eventually they see market share available and they're just like, let's take those over. I think that's kind of the next thing is what you're talking about, because you're starting to see indigenous people get a global reach now, like not just in the United States. Like they're getting, I can think of a handful on my head right now where it's like they got 500,000 to 1 million followers. And it's just like at some point, with enough affiliate marketing and ad campaigns, like they're going to get a big contract from somebody to do something big that's very public.
Right. And for me, like my stance is like as someone who subscribes to Marxism, socialism, and communism, for me, the initial thing was, and I think most socialists and communists take this position, is that the film industry pumps out a lot of ideology. It pumps out a lot of ideology about class. It can stigmatize poor people. It can reinforce capitalist ruling class positions. And to me, that also that speaks to like what you and I have kind of talked about in terms of indigenous representation as racist and stereotypes, or in need of intervention to be civilized. That Hollywood isn't just something that pumps out stuff we enjoy. Like it doesn't just pump out stuff. It shapes how we see things.
That's a huge
and this
point.
Is why,
right?
Yeah. And this is why, like, we can't just talk about the economics of Hollywood. We also have to talk about like the function of the ideology, which I might be another podcast episode. But it shows that for me why the importance of like the common phrase of like, oh, we need to seize the means of production. In this case, it's like indigenous people need to seize means of production or means of representation that are not just of like that are, they need to be able to like build their own type of their productions. And for me, that's a very crucial point. But I also don't want to divorce that from like actual political organizing and politics of like, a lot of socialists are like, we need to build a party, which, hey, if you want to build an indigenous party, let's do it, but anyways, but yeah, like that, to me, that's like why I was like, no, like the reason why we are getting these shitty ass representations, for the most part, not talking about like natives, doing native stuff, is because we just don't have the ownership, the management, or control over these things, which is like a very big thing, part of like socialist and communist ideas. It's like, hey, we need to have ownership of this. We need to have democratic ownership of these issues. And I think what you and I are thinking about with these smaller productions is like, yeah, this is like a very micro version of that, where like Boney Warpony has like 3 people who like own the cameras, work together, figure out the script, and they're putting out content. It's very niche, but they're putting out content. And then you have YouTubers who don't necessarily own YouTube, but they participate and they have enough autonomy to where they can actually like do what they want. And I think my initial like reaction is to like support them, share them.
Same with at a larger level. More people are more familiar with is the 1491s. I mean, those guys have all used their content to leverage their way into like the work that they do on FX and actual TV.
Right. No, I was gonna like because then because I was talking to a friend of mine and he knows one of the 1491s, and I was like, how do they feel about this? And they're like, no, this I haven't I was gonna reach out to that person because I also know them well as well. And I've actually like sent the messages like, hey, let me write something, but me being me, I never like followed through with it. But I had some funny skits and I was like, this would be really funny, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, but okay. I never sent them anything, so it's my fault. But my point is like, I don't judge these folks for engaging in this. I actually like the cynical part of me where it was like, oh, this is just profit. Like it's meaningless. It's not important.
Yeah.
Kind of like moved away as I became more serious in organizing, which is like, this is how indigenous people survive. This is how they are able to at least support themselves and are able to challenge their material conditions that are produced by colonialism and capitalism. And that means to engage in this kind of thing. I think for the most, go ahead.
I was going to interrupt you because you're making the parallel that you wanted to make when we first talked, and is that you can make this analogous to the trading posts and how this is what we talked to. Like, while it seems like we're grossly overmatched and we look at a situation where we need to be able to go to their table because they hold the currency that is going to be exchanged that we can use somewhere else. Right now, the currency that we have doesn't have the same worth, so we have to go to them and barter and advocate for ourselves. And there's only a few games in town right now, and so really that's our only means is to say like, okay, here's what I have. You get to tell me what it's worth and give me in return what you think it's worth.
Right, exactly. And I jokingly said that because I was like, the reason why I said that was because I listened to your episode about
Zombieland,
mm-hmm. Right? And they were like, what? And I was like, that it was such a like I never even thought about it. I forgot about it. I was like, oh shit, like I didn't even notice there was a trading post. Or maybe I did, I just completely spaced it. But then I was like, well, the structure of monopoly capitalism, it seems very similar to how trading posts operated on the Navajo Nation or in like on the frontier, which is they kind of control the market because they're the only people out there,
mm-hmm.
And that's where Native people go to exchange things. Now, where I'm interpreting it is that kind of following the Marxist idea of use value and exchange value. And when you make something that you use like a blanket solely for using it, that's exchange value. But when you start to engage in commodification and market forces and market exchange, then you start to engage in capitalist activities. And I think, because of how prominent trading posts are and the need to support oneself, you have to then kind of engage in that. You like, hey, I don't have enough to meet my means. I'm going to make this blanket that I can sell to or exchange for the trader in terms of a loan, and hopefully I can pay it back. And that article I sent you, I think it's a good article, but my critiques were, it makes traders seem so benevolent, almost like, oh, we're just out here, but I'm like, why are you out there? Like, you're out there to make money. You're out there to make a living. You're out there because indigenous people were forcefully removed and then constrained to this piece of land. Not piece of land. That sounds very like derogatory of our traditional lands, but to this smaller portion of our traditional lands. And I was like, that's weird. Why would they like try to make trading posts look non-exploitative? When in my interpretation of history, it's very exploitative because people then like, they don't get to engage in their creative processes. They don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're hitting on something really important because you have certain, I mean, we saw it in the pandemic, you have certain things that are commodities that should remain static. Commodities in the sense that like in the retail market, you walk into a supermarket, things that prices like never fluctuate because you think of really canned goods is the best thing I can think of because of their shelf life, because of how readily available they are and how many competitors there are in the market. Like those prices are pretty static. So usually those are commodities, but then you have things that fluctuate like toilet paper. We didn't know could, fluctuate. Now there's a different market for that. But the why I bring that up is in the trading post example, you have certain things like, okay, you bring wool to me, that's more of a commodity because the market, at least back then, the market is going to say like, here's the price. So you bring me 50 pounds of that, we got the price written down on us behind the wall. That's what we're charging for today. That's the market price today. So even though it's not technically not a commodity, like that price is going to stay pretty static unless there's some like major economic force that happens or some economic headwind that gets them to change the price up and down. But then you have something like that really becomes an asset, like what you're talking about with the wool blankets, with the Navajo Pendleton blankets, or you have sterling silver jewelry. That's when it gets dangerous, because when you have assets that somebody can replicate or find a way to wholesale those and drive down the prices that they're going to be buying for that so they can increase their margins, that's when it gets dangerous. And that's what we're kind of seeing with this mark. That's like the fear, I guess, is seeing that history recreate itself, manifest again in the industry that we're seeing now, where we're advocating for indigenous representation. But is it really doing what we just saw again, where they're like, they see a blanket and they're like, holy shit, you can get that much off of that? I'm going to make that myself so I can get some of that.
Right. No, I think you make a great point when you say we need to think of it in terms of now. Like one of the tenets of settler colonial theory, which is like a theory to describe what's going, the history, U.S. histories, the history of the U.S. and the role in its relation to indigenous people, is that it never stopped. It's ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't think about Hollywood in terms of like settler colonialism, which I think speak to like the non-economic aspect of things, which is like racism, the removal of indigenous people, the vanishing Indian, the Indian in need of civilization. It fits that character, but it's coherent with the theory of settler colonialism on that portion. But I think what you and I think really talked about today speaks to like the other half of settler colonialism, which is the capitalist project of turning things into property, making everybody into wage workers or some type of worker that isn't necessarily paid by wages, but nonetheless, the economic motives behind it. And I think,
I mean, that goes back to the Dawes Allotment Act, trying to make us all into yeoman farmers, really just make us like community members instead of one large community, like, and put fences between us and get us to own our 2 cows and a sheep and, till our own land and say like, get off my land kind of thing. It's absolutely what you're describing.
Right. It's like, what if I don't want to be a farmer? What if I want to be a fucking movie director? Like, it takes away our chances of doing that.
Yep.
But yeah, to return to this idea of like, the trading post, I was like, holy shit, like this sounds like native people are leveraging what they have to the trading post person and based on like market forces and they always put this reliance on trust, like, oh, I trust you. Like I'm like, all right, yeah. But there's also like you have the power of the army to like, and the Rangers to come and back you if you think some Navajo person stole from you.
Yep.
Like it's not really, it's very coercive that they don't talk about. Which I think
that's a great fucking point. Yeah.
It fits with Hollywood. Like the people that are engaging in media production and representation production via film or working as the sound person. I keep using that because I don't know the rest of them. I should know, like the cinematographer, but I'm really interested in film. But anyways, so like that's what they have to deal with. They are working with conditions not of their choosing. I think Marx summed it up best, where in relation to describing workers, the growing proletariat in Europe, these people are dealing with this capitalist conditions that are forcing them to do certain practices or activities, but they still find a way. And he advocates like collective, like we need to work together. We need to like actually, either strike or organize to dismantle capitalist activities and whatnot. And we need to advocate for ourselves. And I think that's something that is kind of coming up, is simmering with a lot of like these people working together, is that there's a need to work together. But I think it just differs. Like people have different ideas of how to do that. And I'm not one to like argue with people of how they think to do it. But my personal idea is just like, yeah, like we need to like build this kind of economic side of things, like dual power, or not, I guess not dual power is more political, but the other side of the coin is like, we need to organize ourselves. We need to advocate for tribal sovereignty, self-determination. We need to take seriously like land back, these social movements, But we also have to be respectful of that. We can't just like just because we're forced into capitalist wage work and capitalist activities doesn't grant us excuses to actually reproducing that, like the commodification. Like, I'm not going to go to fucking Line 3 and be like a documentary and then, like commodify the fuck out of it.
Where the prime example of this is like universal basic income isn't effective if we all spend it on Amazon,
Right. Like, I mean, yeah. So like, there's so much that I think we covered that I was like, holy, like, again, that work really well with like thinking through the connection between indigenous representation, the economic structures in Hollywood, particularly with the corporations, and thinking about like theories of like how people, whether in different positions of power, have to engage in capitalism, whether it's the CEO who likes the racist Western movies and thinks we should do more, but also as his position needs to make profit, so he has to do more woke versions of it, and begrudgingly, despite getting paid like six figures for like an hour of work, or the native writers who've like fucking spent their life like sweat and blood like trying to get to where they're at, and who've really put that amount of work. Like it helps us understand that. And
I think what you're saying is really important, because you look at the Hollywood diversity report, and at first glance, you would say, well, there's just no native actors, there's no native directors, there's not enough native writers. I think a philanthropist at first would think like, oh, we need to, in a third world country mindset, like a mindset of scarcity, like they just don't have enough people that want to do this, when it's really the opposite. We have plenty of people that want to do this, but they just don't get to do it, or they refuse to play the game because they're like, well, I don't want to have to play the game of like being ethnically ambiguous to get other work to maintain a career in Hollywood, or I don't want to play the game that you have laid out because it goes against my cultural values. It goes against who I am as a person. And so I don't want to play. So I'm just going to go do something else.
Right. Like it for me, it helps me understand why people do the things that they do, or maybe not fully, but it gives me a good glimpse as to how to understand how indigenous people survive like these late stages of capitalism, the decline of US imperialism, and other declines and other upticks in like, or flashpoints of like social movements,
right,
that are not necessarily completely cynical. Like I think a couple of years ago, like I said, I'd be like, oh, I don't care, like it's meaningless, like I kind of felt that originally with that Netflix Chambers. Like I was like, I don't care. But the more I thought about it and the more I organized, like that show meant a lot to people. Like it was meaningful to them. And as someone who's trying to organize and get people to collectively work together, I can't just alienate someone because I think their show is meaningless. But it also like as an organizer, like to be an organizer, to be a socialist, you have to be social, and you can't be an asshole. You have to understand why people are doing that. And for me, I was like, wait, there's some shit that are problematic that I find very meaningful, like fucking Predator. Like, I love that movie. I know it's like it's not the great. It's like hyper masculine,
same,
whatever. And I enjoy Dancing with Wolves.
It's right with homophobia. It's right with like toxic masculinity. But you're just like, God damn it, I can't separate myself enough to like hate this movie.
Right. And it's like a lot of natives like that movie.
Yeah.
So it's like
huge.
If I'm really gonna be serious about this work, I need to know how to talk to people, to convey ideas. And that might like no one, and that's the thing I had to learn the hard way, is that no one, when you organize, no one is initially on your side or agrees completely with you, and that you shouldn't expect that, because that's just not the reality of things. People are very embedded with a lot of patriarchal, capitalist, masculine ideas of the world that if you're organizing, you have to work to educate and kind of through practice and solidarity have to work those things out so that they're not the same person, but you are not the same person as well through that process. It's collective. And so
it really goes down to like something that we don't have enough of in today's world. It's like discourse. Like I found myself starving for discourse after I left college, because I graduated undergrad in like 2010. and I left undergrad, and I was like hurting for that. I'm like, man, I miss discourse when you can just like stumble into a lobby or a common room and people are just ready to talk about the world's problems, and you can just have a deep, meaningful conversation that was thought provoking, and frankly, also like ignorant because we were so young and we just didn't really know the world yet. But it was fun to have those like deep, meaningful conversations, and you weren't so quick to just call somebody out on, you weren't quick to like turn somebody off because you disagreed with a point and you were to turn them off. And I feel like that's where we are now. And I hope that we can entertain these kind of conversations moving forward, because my fear bringing you on was because some people would not be like apt to listen because you're an avid Marxist, you're socialist, and this, or at least that's like what you subscribe to be on your social media. And I don't hold that against you. You got a ton of great points, man. And while I don't subscribe to be a Marxist, like there's a lot of shit that you say that like I find myself like nodding my head to, and I'm like, God damn it, this guy's on a lot of good stuff. And I think that we need to have these kinds of like holistic conversations and analyzing different viewpoints from the social, political, economic viewpoints to say like, okay, why are they doing what they're doing now? Why now? And then understanding the why will help us understand where do we go from here. It sucks that it took like an hour and a half conversation to basically say like, go watch Rutherford Falls.
Right.
Go support it.
It's so funny that you mentioned that because I keep name dropping Andrew, but he really helped me flesh this out. Because when Rutherford Falls came out, he's like, "Have you seen it?" And I've seen social media going like blitz about it, and I'm like, it sounds great, but I haven't seen it. And he was like, "Dog, you need to go watch it, subscribe, because that's." And this is what he said. He was like, and this is like, we didn't touch upon this, but we didn't talk about how subscribers are, how subscriptions are pretty much the main basis of the economy for for streaming services. And he was like, just go there and you don't even have to watch it, just to subscribe and watch a couple episodes or watch all of it, not to say that it's not good, but like to really help out, to signal or I guess like how, if we take neoclassical, to signal to the CEOs and the people that this is profit worthy, like it's worth investing in. And I was like, oh shit, and I haven't seen it, but I definitely need to, like, fuck it.
You know how they get you though, and how they're going to find out is, if natives aren't willing to get behind the paywall, because the first 3 episodes are free and you have to pay to get the next 7.
Oh shit. Okay. I might just be like, yo, everybody, here's $7, mutual aid, go help out, but yeah, no, I to return to what you're talking about, like this idea. Yeah. I mean, there are some people I'll entertain, like I'm willing to have like a very like good faith conversation.
Good faith is a big point. Is a big like, caveat, right?
Yeah, and I'm willing to have those conversations, but there's just other people I'm like, nah, like it's not worth it. Like I'm not willing to talk to these people, or like I've been invited by some other podcasters to be like, hey, be on this, and I'm like, I don't know, like it sounds like it's more not necessarily it's not going to be a good conversation. And this has just been my experience with like, as someone who came out of ASU who was extremely like masculine and like hella confident and cocky, I would just argue with random people on Facebook. And I was like, yo, I can't be doing this shit, because I'm like, my principles are to this ideology of socialism and communism, but I'm alienating these people who could be really good comrades. Like I need to be more more careful, intricate as to what to do this. And so I stopped arguing with people on the internet for the most part, unless there's like some really brazen like people out there. But yeah, generally my approach is like, hey, like if people are willing to listen, I'm willing to listen to why people do the things that they do, because it helps me understand like how people are interpreting, how people are navigating what they're doing. So I was really excited because I was like, I wonder what you would bring to like this conversation of monopoly capitalism, and I was really happy that you were able to talk about these different product lines and whatnot, because I'm like, this fits, like this makes sense to me. Like I don't necessarily agree with all the current orthodox economics theories, but I understand how people interpret them, and I'm like, oh great, like that helps me understand this even more because it fits with that. But it's all about like having good, reasonable, good faith conversations that are not debates.
Absolutely. And this is, I mean, It's okay to have debates, but I think it needs to be well intentioned from the start. Like you're looking to have a conversation. If it evolves into a debate, that's fine. But if your intention is to have a debate with somebody, it's gonna be nasty, and it's not gonna yield any any opening of mindsets or like open any corridors where like you're open to that the other person's perspective.
Right, exactly. And I think one thing that I've made clear, and this is how I've decided to, whenever I have someone, like personally, when I do invite people to talk, I'm like, hey, what is there anything you want me to read? Like kind of homework, but it's also like the activity of building up trust. Which is why I sent that to you, because I was like, all right, if I'm gonna do this, I at least need you to know where I'm coming from. You don't have to read all of them. Maybe just skim it. But that to me was like a demonstration, like, oh, I'm taking this seriously. And I think that's what a good conversation has, is if both people are well informed or did research about it ahead of time.
For sure.
And it makes it smoother. It's not just like, it's like, oh yeah, like so and so, like, like it's just reasonable.
It sucks to have the interview too, where it's like one of my first interviews with Charlene Teeters was like that. Like I only knew In Whose Honor about her, and like the first 5 minutes, one of my really good buddies, he's like, "You were fucking nervous, weren't you?"
Oh yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I was nervous, and he was like, "Is it?" And it wasn't because of her; it's because I didn't know her at all. We hadn't laid the groundwork to like it, so it took a few minutes for both of us to kind of like pull our guard back a little bit of like, oh, this is going to be a genuine conversation. Because even though you agree to an interview, you really don't know what you're getting into until you really get to know the person. So that's why I was happy you came on, and I hope you come on again to talk about something else, whether it's a specific movie or something else. But
I was like, I wanted to talk about. I don't know. Have you done Wind Talkers yet?
Yeah, I did. But let's talk about it.
I was like, yo, the fact that like Native representation is like in existence with the fucking Nicolas Cage like appearance is like, it blows my mind. Like, I was thinking about, I was like, man, it'd be fun if I just figure out all the movies Nicolas Cage did with natives, but I think it's only one at this point. But I mean, yeah, I'd love to have,
unless there was a native and leaving Las Vegas somewhere. Like, I don't think there's, I think, so it's interesting you bring up profit maximization, because my thought process around Wind Talkers was, it was John Woo. Like when you go back and you dig, like John Woo wanted to make a war movie. And at the time, there was like Saving Private Ryan, Thin Red Line. There were so many, like the market was saturated with war movies, especially World War II movies. And he didn't have an opportunity to do it. So he's like, I need another angle that's going to get greenlit. And so Wind Talkers came about, the script came across his table, and he was like, yeah, let's do this. And he wanted to work with Nicolas Cage again, because he worked with him in Face Off, I believe. And so that's how they ended up making that movie, because John Woo wanted to make a war film, but it had to be profitable. So boom, there you go. And it had to be different.
See, we figured it out. We fucking figured it out with this podcast. But yeah, no, I wanted to end for the listeners, to give some like prominent Native movies, to let people know, like, and this is to like give people the kind of like to entice people to do their research about these movies that come out, like what companies, because once you start doing that, you start to realize like, oh shit, this is very like, it's a very big, large network that's meshed together. Like Smoke Signals, 1998, Miramax. It was sold to Miramax put that out, and eventually it was sold to Viacom, which is one of the 6 that I mentioned that own another company. Pocahontas, 1995, Buena Vista, which was owned by Disney. I mean, well, I guess that's pretty straightforward. Last of the Mohicans, a Morgan Creek production. It was distributed by 21st Century Fox, but then internationally it was distributed by Warner.
No shit.
Thunderheart, 1992, distributed by TriStar, which then was a subsidy of Sony. And then Billy Jack was distributed by Warner. Dances with Wolves was distributed by Orion, which is making a comeback. Shout out to Orion.
Nice.
Which was originally under MGM, but now is under Amazon. So it's like, holy shit. Like it's, like you're starting to see these companies show up.
Absolutely. And I think that's being a responsible viewer. And some people, they just want to tune out and they just want to consume content, and that's okay. Like if you just want to be a participant in it, like that's okay. I'm not asking anybody to be, to be someone like Marley, who's like an organizer. and trying to get people around a message or around a cause or anything. But I think as a person who cares about indigenous representation, being a responsible person who I shouldn't say responsible, being someone that cares about indigenous representation in mainstream media, I think we should really be looking and doing the work that what you're talking about is finding out like, where is this coming from? Like, who's pushing this out? Who's distributing this? Who's producing this? And then think about other instances. Like I think about Paranormal Activity, where it's like it went from straight to streaming, and then the production companies were like, whoa, 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 that's some money rolling out the front door. We can take care of it. And then they reproduced it and then relaunched it. In 2007 it came out. Then it was mass produced and distributed in 2009. And now they cranked out freaking like 5 of those things after that. So I think we should be like checking motivations and maybe not like hyper analyzing it like we're doing, because I don't think that's healthy. I think having these conversations every once in a while is good, but not all the time. But I really, yeah. But I think, I think doing what you're talking about is extremely important, is to look at, the motivations behind these.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's not always philanthropic and it's not always for the goodness of your heart.
Right. I mean, I think it's generally like, yeah, as people who consume media, we should question where it comes from and what the function is. I as someone, and this might be a conversation, maybe more for another podcast episode, but maybe the role of film industry in relation to like U.S. imperialism. And we should, as consumers, people who. And I'm using consumers not as the economic term, but just as people who, I guess, like consume this type of thing, that we should question it and we should develop our understandings of it, because a lot of it speaks to the way capitalism operates and the way that settler colonialism operates that we currently live in. And, if we're serious about really pushing back against this, we need to be able to articulate. I guess we need to understand what's going on, articulate, and then act upon it. And, even small things like this, you're like, oh shit, like there's all these companies.
Yeah. And I kind of want to close on something we talked about before, where it's like, we really also need to be careful about what we allow other people to make for us. When I talked I was off air, I talked to Marley about the documentary, or really the book Born to Run, by was it, I can't remember his name, the author, Doug McDougall, I think it is. But the book Born to Run is like his experience with the Tarahumara in Mexico, the Rara and his experience running with those people, and kind of they lived in like the deepest canyons in the world, and they have like some of the healthiest people there, and they're like natural marathon runners, like ultra marathon runners. And he wanted to go as a white guy, like be amongst them and figure like what makes these people tick, like what makes them so special. And out of that book, Born to Run, spawned the minimalist shoes, spawned like the Vibram 5-finger shoes, where it's like barefoot running is the way to go. And there was a documentary called The Infinite Race that was on ESPN Plus that came out years later. That came out just like a year or two ago. And it has one of the women who is of the community, who is Rara Murray. And she's just like, it's a slap in the face to see the commercialization of something that we do out of necessity, because we're barefoot running. We're making treads out of leather straps and tire treads because that's all we have access to. Like if we had a Nike store and the ability to buy Asics and New Balance, we would do that. But instead you have these companies come in and they romanticize our plight, really. And they say like, oh, look at these people. They're like, you romanticize their experiences. You romanticize why they're barefoot runners, and you tie it to their connection to the land, their connection to their culture, when really it's out of necessity. And I think we should be a little guarded at times when people want to like take over, and I mean, not take over, but have us participate in things, because there's potential for them to strong arm their way into like controlling the narrative and controlling the direction that is consumed.
Right. No, I think it's a great point. I was thinking about that in terms of like, what is cultural appropriation? Like I think we very rarely scratch the surface of it, but I think cultural appropriation is how people get radicalized or build consciousness about issues in indigenous communities. But for me, I was also thinking like, how does the market, kind of going back to profit ideas, how does that influence cultural appropriation? And I think you summed it up best with that example. But also thinking about our politics, what are the philosophical premises that operate that allow people to think they have this kind of access. Liberalism tends to think like equate everything, therefore everybody should have access to something. Even the economy or the way capitalist markets function are like, hey, anything can be a commodity, therefore we should access it. It should be used and have value on it. So there's a lot of these conversations that are being had, and to really analyze it, to investigate them, has to like kind of involve us to really think about these more like abstract ideas of what's going on. Like, why do people feel the need to do this? And I agree. I think we should be guarded with this, or we should guard certain things. Certain people do not have access to things. I think one way I'm interpreting it is like multiculturalism is this idea that, we should respect all cultures and, engage in their activities. But it's like, no, like not when you're an indigenous people whose culture is systemically erased through like education or in person like genocide. We deserve the right, we have the right to protect some of our knowledge that we consider sacred, that only should be discussed amongst us. Whereas multiculturalism, I think, and maybe this is a straw man version of it, but to me it's like, oh no, everybody should engage in this. Like, you have some white dude who's wearing a bindi, an Indian bindi, or wearing like some like Asian, like headdress, and like, this is multiculturalism. And then
my fear is that we end up having all of these platforms have one-offs, or maybe one or two off like representations of, like, Netflix has a native show, Amazon has a native show, Peacock has one, and you get like Disney Plus that has one. And then you're going to have natives paying like fucking like $80 a month to consume something that really they only care about for like 4 different things. And you're getting these communities pulled in so many different directions. So while Rutherford Falls is a win, we do have to guard ourselves in the sense that we don't want to have that where we're like, have to be, everything is behind a paywall, and everything always is behind a paywall, or everything always is, with a hitch. There's always a caveat, whether it's sponsors, but it's not on YouTube. This stuff isn't being pushed out on YouTube. It's pushed behind the $9 or $7.99 a month subscription,
Yeah. No, I agree. I think everything you said is on point with what I was talking about. But yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to keep us too long because I have to get going soon, but
yeah, it's okay.
I will end on, no, I won't. I think I'll save that for another conversation about more how academics are interpreting how certain economic or certain political theories by indigenous academics have some very interesting insight into this. But I just wanted to say thank you. I really appreciated this. I'm really hoping to turn this into something I write and really flesh out later in my life. Maybe sooner. I don't know. I'm working on my thesis right now, so I can't really write anything out. So, but having this conversation really helped me think about the dimensions of it. And I really appreciate you having this. So this is when you asked me, it combined a lot of my favorite things right now, which is movies, economic theory, Marxism, and indigenous representation. And I was like, fuck yeah, like this is awesome.
I think like I said earlier, it's like, I hate this episode because I'm gonna have to listen to it like 2 or 3 times, and I don't like listening to myself. But you dropped a bunch of knowledge in this, and I think there's a lot of economic theory and things that, like, I just have an MBA, I give like really base level, like economic theory, and it's very like with a capitalist corporate lens. And so there's a lot of stuff that you brought up that I'm like, well, I need to educate myself on like certain Marxist economic theory to get a better understanding where you're coming from, because there was nothing you said today that I didn't disagree with or that I didn't. Right. And I'm just like, man, he's got a lot of great points. So
yeah, no, I feel you. Like a lot of things you said, I'm like, no, I think that's the thing about organizing is people generally have similar ideas, and you just kind of have to work with like understanding it together.
100%.
But I appreciate this.
Yeah. No, you'll definitely have to come back on, man, for sure.
Definitely.